This is All Things Fitness and Wellness, uniting industry thought leaders and fitfluencers on the mission to inspire innovation and encourage people to live a life fit and well. Brought to you by British Columbia Personal Training Institute. Learn how to train, gain, and retain clients. Visit bcpti.ca. In today's episode, we hear from Julian DeSchutter. Julian is a serial entrepreneur and adventurer. His social media is filled with snaps that capture awe-inducing moments, and along his journey, he has helped many discover their state of flow. In 2016, he co-founded Chasing Sunrise, an experience-based adventure company that centered solely around creating community and epic memories. So in today's episode, Julian shares his views on wellness, which involve exploring the art of living, stepping out of the conditioned mind, and getting curious about ourselves and how we live our lives. Before we get to it, be sure to hit like and subscribe. We have new episodes of the Industry Series every Monday and the Celebrity Series every Wednesday. This is ATFW. You're somebody that is pure in their goal to motivate others. So I'm so happy to have you on the show today. I want to revert back to your early years because I find there's something fascinating about individuals that have purpose and meaning behind sharing the voice of fitness and wellness and self-discovery. Where do you find that root or essence in yourself started to culminate?
I think if I go back to when I was, a kid, and it was always just permission. It was just permission to play, to explore, to have fun, and to move into a space that just flowed without the justification of it has to have a reason for flow. It has to, right? And that was something that as I grew up, you start to explore different things and you're I want to go down this. And as you get older, so many people are well, why are you doing that? Why are you? And for me, just that thing was curiosity and just a continuous willingness to dive into that flow, to play with it. And then lucky enough to be surrounded by friends and family that reinforced that. So that by the time I, grew up into a teenager, it was more embedded in who I was. And it was interesting as I got older and older and older to realize how much pressure is trying to push you to essentially justify your existence rather than just to experience for the sake of experiencing.
It's so true because as children, when you grow up, you don't have that filter. It is all about being in this curious mindset. And as we get older or go through the way the school systems currently are, we start to shed away those layers of themselves. So it's amazing that you had an early awareness to really tap into that because there's a lot of power in that. So in the introduction, we heard you're a serial entrepreneur. Talk to me about your first forays into entrepreneurship and how this blended into what you were tapping into as a person.
Yeah, I think that's a story where it really hit against the wall there where I think I was 18 years old at the time and I was looking just essentially for jobs to pay my way through school. And I ended up taking a course in bartending. Looked like good money. It was just easy. It was one of those things worked around school. And I was going through, it was a 2-week course. And by the end of it, the bartending school actually turned out to be for sale. And I went to my parents. I was like, hey, I want to buy this. I had no idea what I was doing. It was one of those things that I was like, hey, why not? They're running it. I can run it. And the immediate response from my parents were, interesting. How come? And it wasn't that oh, you're 18 years old. You have no idea what you're doing or, it's too risky. That's all a bad idea. It was just interest and curiosity into who I was. And I just had this, I guess, compelling enough narrative to go through it and be I want to buy it because I see what they're doing. I don't think they're doing a very good job of it. You kind of have that young kid bravado. And they ended up letting me buy it. I don't know why they did it, but they helped grab some of their money from their house and put it towards it. And I think that was the first time in the real world where I was allowed to, in a big way, go do something that I thought was the right idea. There was a huge, potential risk behind it. And once again, it was reinforced by having people behind me that, rather than attacking the idea and breaking it down, we're let's go explore this. And that, for me, I realized in hindsight, it had happened over and over and over again in smaller and smaller ways. But that was the first time I came out into the world in a way that had risk, could have potentially gone wrong, but also was this reinforcing thing to believe in, the ideas that we have in ourselves. And the better question was, why not me?
Love that. How did you hone that mindset? Because at 18, there's influences and distractions coming from all different facets of life. So what do you think provided that capability to be that honed into mindset and start something so bold?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think, we believe that it's intentional, and there's the hero narrative where they have it together and they have this big grandiose vision and they're going to go out there and I worked really hard. Curiosity. That was it. It was just, in a lot of ways, slightly sloppy, and it was worst case scenario, you lose the money, and at 18 years old, it was a ton of money and it probably would have, had some pretty bad effects. But at the same time, it was nothing irrecoverable. And it was the realization kind of in that moment that, if you're waiting to have everything in there or you're holding on too tight, the whole thing falls apart. And so at the time, I really had no plan, no real understanding, but I had the curiosity and I trusted my willingness and my drive to do it. And I think that's like one of the most powerful things is, nowadays there's so many opportunities to do all these things where it's like, there is no right framework. And if we're looking for the right framework, by the time we find it, everything's past us. And so it's more leaning into that thing of like, really, what's the downside? And then trusting those little pings inside of us that tell us, they're called tacit knowledge, where like, something, but before you actually understand it. And so I think it was more a predisposition to like lean into that than it was a grandiose thing of like a mindset or anything like that.
I love how you put that, because even on your website, I saw a quote that was basically like, I appreciate if you're inspired by me, but don't emulate me verbatim, because you are yourself and be yourself. And that's exactly what you're doing when you're saying, scrap the framework. This is just me. And I'm going to apply myself to this and see where it takes me. Yeah.
And play with it. And we're exposed to like so many different people now and so many different ways of doing things. And there's a really beautiful quote that it's like, if you take from one, you're a thief. If you take from 1,000, you're original. Right. And it's just that understanding that like ideas build on themselves over time, but there's no unique combination of somebody with your knowledge, your understanding, all that stuff sitting there with a framework directly for you. And you have to really like play with that sense of self and that relationship with self that goes, all of these ideas can work. How do they apply back to me? And you see it when somebody is like directly taking concepts from somebody else and trying to fit them to themselves. There's that like slight inauthenticity, which in the beginning when you're learning, totally cool. But you, in my opinion, always want to like play with that space of like, what's right for me? Because that's ultimately the thing that allows you to play on the front edge, to build and create and have fun in whatever it is.
Well, and that's the beauty of being a creator, is that there are boundless options of the mind of who you are. It is endless. And I think that so often as human beings, we forget that we have this creative abstract art playground that's just living inside of our minds and itching to get out when we pay attention to it. Because again, I think it's very easy to be distracted, and then we bypass that innate feeling that we have within us to put it out there. So I'm curious, after you go into that, tell me where your relationship to the fitness and wellness space starts to come into play and you realize that's something you really want to niche down to.
When I think about like fitness and wellness, I describe like the holisticness of an individual experiencing life, right? And that's the really interesting thing when I look at the way we've kind of built the world, where the mind is so good at separating all of these things, but the separation of them is essentially a concept in our mind rather than the reality of our own experience, right? The reality of our experience is this messy ball of wellness, which consists of the mind, the body, emotions, the spirit, the psyche, all together in this physical thing that's running all day long. And my understanding and like desire to get into it really just started out of experiencing my own life, like going back to those moments. I've very much been driven by flow. And just where are those states where like life fades away, because those are the states that in me like really just make me feel alive. They make me feel awe. They make me feel something larger than me. And so, after I bought the bartending school, I was still going to business school. I was still doing this kind of consultancy thing where I'm playing these two worlds. On one hand, here's this like messy at that time, like 20-year-old kid that was running bartending schools on the weekends, having a ton of fun, playing with his friends. And then here's this kid in like kind of a suit and tie trying to fit into this world, and the tension between them. And really just realizing where I felt whole and where I felt flow was when I stopped trying to like become and play this role, even at the expense of all my peers being like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this thing? And I remember, I think I was 22 and I turned down a couple of offers from some of the big consulting firms to basically chase nothing, right? To just step into the world and just go after building what was a company that didn't even exist yet. And I had this one mentor that's like, basically, like, what the hell are you doing? Here's this golden ticket. And what I realized in that moment, it was like, it was his golden ticket. It was his dream, his desire. But no part of me wanted to do that. And I was so afraid that if I took that, I would lose that like messy spark that like kept me alive, because that was direct in contrast to being successful in this. And so wellness for me was born out of kind of playing with those and wrestling with those of just, when do I feel most at peace, most at flow, most embodied inside of myself? And from that just kind of led me down this kind of rabbit hole of learning about all the different areas, how they go together, and really fascinated with almost the thing of, why don't we look at this more when it's like, it was so foundational to my well-being. And then you kind of look around and you're like, but we don't really look at, like, we don't look at this stuff, and we just kind of pretend about it. And it really led me into this understanding that like most of what I thought wellness was a automatic function of being alive. And that was when it really started to get interesting, because I'm like, I have no idea what's happening here. Yeah. And I can influence it, and I can put it in the right environments, and I can put the right stuff in it. But I've never built my cells. I've never repaired my body. And that's when it kind of really, really got deep and got really interesting, because there's clearly so much more going on in our bodies than we have to pay attention to at the surface.
So when you talk about a holistic approach, is that what you mean when you refer to biohacking?
So,
what's the correlation? Because honestly, I'm not as familiar with biohacking. I've heard the term, and I think a lot of people can relate the term, but I actually don't have a well understanding of it. That's why you're hanging out with me.
Yeah, and that's another one of those things where, we use words as concepts, because if I go fitness, somebody understands or loosely understands what I'm saying, right? But when you start to look into that, it's like, is that fitness as in strength training, fitness as in endurance running, fitness and in Zumba? They're all fitness. And so I started to realize that we use these words as shortcuts to communicate, even though they're just like loose extrapolations of what we're actually talking about. And so when I started to kind of like look into something like biohacking, traditionally we're talking about influencing molecules in our body, right? So you might metabolize fat a certain way, and if I put this molecule in it, it changes how fast you can metabolize it. And it led down like a very scientific rabbit hole of understanding how the molecules, are working in my body. And really quickly, it led me to the space of like, but if I'm stressed and my body's not doing that function, it's going to change it. So let's move biohacking from just like the molecules into the emotional state, which then you start thinking about the psyche. And it, really quickly moves into the space where it gets really confusing, because you're layering all of these things. But ultimately, whether we have the concepts for them or not, that's what's happening inside of the body. And so each one of these things has led like all these little threads that you start pulling on that lead you to a whole world that you can't really ignore. So like if we talk biohacking, but we haven't looked at trauma, and you've had traumatic experiences in your life, your biology that you're trying to hack is directly influenced by this trauma over here. And they're separate things in many ways, but also deeply connected. And that just goes on over and over. And so my curiosity is always, what are these things? How do they permeate out? And how do you influence the certain ones to ultimately bring me back to a space of wellness and health where I essentially feel at peace and whole and engaged and present, which I think is what so many people are seeking. And the really interesting thing for me is when I feel most at peace, it's when my body almost completely disappears, which goes back to that flow space. Is like when I'm in flow, I don't think about my body. I don't think about pain. I don't think about all the emotional stuff. I don't think about my brain. There's just essentially presence experiencing life, right? And that it's, as you start to see, you're like, oh, it actually starts to weave over itself over and over and over again.
Turn your passion for fitness into a career with British Columbia Personal Training Institute. Taught by personal trainers, BCPTI combines classroom and in-gym training to give you the tools needed to succeed in the fitness industry and make an impact. With a simple formula focused on service, science, and sales, prospective personal trainers learn how to gain, train, and retain clients. Visit bcpti.ca for more information.
It's an incredible feeling when you are in that state of flow. That's why I end up taking time in nature so often, because it really is where I'm able to shed the chatter of the mind.
Conditioned mind that's like, doo, doo, doo.
100%. And it's a never-ending process. Like, what tools have you used? I know obviously you headed up Chasing Sunrise for many years, which I think is probably an initiative that impacted so many souls, because even how many of you have not woke up for a sunrise? Like, get off your ass and do it, because it is a breathtakingly beautiful thing where you feel so connected in the energy of everything that's available to us. But what are kind of the tools that you started to invite to help, I guess, fuel that state of flow and to add that to part of your being?
Yeah, and I think you just, really hit the main one there. And for me, it was sunrise. It really was this space. And so what ended up happening was me and my roommate at the time, we got up at 4:30 in the morning every day for a month straight. And a crazy thing happens at 4:30 in the morning, because nobody needs anything from you. And anybody that does, they can wait till 8:30 when you used to get up normally.
Unless you work in morning news, but
yes. That is conditional.
That is conditional for sure.
And just that space where the world stopped demanding in. And it was a combination of A, having space, and then B, putting ourselves back in environments that were just larger than us, right? And for us, we stumbled into watching sunrise on top of a mountain, and you're just sitting there and you're like, there's a gigantic fireball in the sky, and we're on these mountains. And it was interesting because where we were, you'd look back down and the whole city's sitting there or sleeping. And you're having this experience that just essentially overwhelms the nervous system. And you feel what I would describe as awe. And you just know that something in that equation is what you're seeking, right? And so from there, it was just this kind of extrapolation to be what other spaces make me feel like that? What kinds of people? And just that inquisition into environment, essentially. What people, what spaces, what things am I doing when kind of that conditioned mind that's constantly, nagging me in some ways just fades away. And just a lot of ways recording that. And then practicing on the other side, trying to learn what my mind's doing, which led me down the rabbit hole of meditation, which allowed me to kind of separate the chatter of my noise or of my brain from the person that's observing it. And so it's interesting because it's moved into the space where it's we're looking for the pill or the thing or where it's what's that one thing we can do to elicit flow, right? And the answer is, if there was that singular thing, we probably would have bottled it up and sold the hell out of it.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's almost that interesting function of the mind where we're always seekers of that thing, when in reality, it generally comes from a culmination of multiple things based on who we are, right? And you could bring that back to fitness of what made somebody healthy, right? And we're they ate this thing. And you're no, they didn't. It was this and that. And so life is the culmination of multiple of these experiences, multiple of these little things that all add up, that bring us over this line that allow us to feel it, right? And sometimes the things that do that are big things, but more often than not, they're the culmination of lots of little things, right? And so for me, breathing is one of those things now where I'm just overwhelmed and you just stop. Oh, I'm here, right? And in that moment, in the out-breath, you just flow into it, right? And so it can come back to something as simple as that. But for me, that came years after getting punched in the face by a sunrise that was whoa, this is crazy. There's something here. We need to look at that.
I think it's amazing when you put it in that perspective too, where you take something like that beautiful moment and having hiked up the mountain and gone up at 4:30 in the morning, and there is a power in that. But then when you realize that so much of this peace or awe or flow that we seek really does come from within and is about taking pause for a moment and paying attention to what's happening within our body and releasing that and letting that go. What are some of your early biggest wrestles with trying to get to that space? Because I do know for myself, for example, meditation, it's been a journey. It's been a journey.
And pretty much every other human.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know there's so many benefits, but it's one of those battles. I know there's so many people that kind of quit before they've even given it a shot because their brain's, okay, we're going to be quiet now. And then the brain's you think we're going to be quiet? Let's rev it up.
And I think that meditation needs a branding campaign. And it needs a branding campaign as well as it needs a campaign to re-explain what it is. Because everybody thinks it's to quiet the mind, which essentially is impossible, right? Like the mind thinks no different than the heart beats, right? Like the default state of a mind at rest is putting thoughts into it. And so if you go into meditation trying to shut off your brain, that's like sitting there and trying to shut off your heart. It just is not possible. What you want to do in meditation is to essentially not attach to those thoughts so that they can come up and you don't immediately jump into a space of emotion and meaning. And the second you start to see that, even for a moment, you go, oh, my brain's crazy. It's just constantly bombarding with thoughts all day. And you start to realize like the state and the nature of the mind, which allows you to have a little bit of distance from it because no longer are you thinking the thoughts that come up are you. You realize the thoughts that come up are just a manufacturing of the mind and that you can choose to relate to them no different than if somebody else walks in the room and says something. You can choose to agree with them or not. Most of us are so close to their mind that we think we are our thoughts, right? And so that practice really helped me realize the whole point of meditation is not to shut the mind off. It's not possible. The point of it is simply to start to realize what my mind is doing so I can be in relation with it. And once I'm in relation with it, now I can start to have an influence over not necessarily the thoughts that come up, but how I react and respond to those thoughts, right? So you might say something to me and I'm like, the brain's immediately like, nope, boundary. And if I think I'm that thought, I emotionally respond and react. As opposed to with meditation, you can train yourself to be like, oh, that thought's really angry. Is that how I actually And you can play with it and just get a little bit of space. And it's really in that pause that you really understand the relationship that you have with your mind. And you realize that almost your entire experience of life has happened somewhere in here. And so whether you're on a mountain watching sunrise or having a breath by yourself in a chair, the entire experience is happening inside here. It can't happen anywhere else, right? And you start to realize, oh, I can build whatever experience I want regardless of where I am, right? And that's when it gets really weird, but it also gets really interesting because you realize how much responsibility you can have to cultivate whatever experience you have of life regardless of what happens to you.
It is fascinating that you say that because I started reading Untethered Soul recently and I kept doing the exercises of taking those steps back. And when you all of a sudden build an awareness of that little voice in the mind, it's 100%
kind of creepy though. You're like,
right?
That's not me.
We've been hanging out this whole time and you never agree on the same thing. It just bounces because it will never give you a definite. It's always all sides of the coin from everywhere. But it's so interesting when you do take that step back. You talk about, though, once you tap into this, having this ability to create for yourself. And it's true, like, we are human beings here to play and explore and have tangible and non-tangible experiences. You're a huge adventurer. So talk me through some of the experiences that have been so impactful, because I know it's one thing to go on an adventure and explore something new, but you're doing it from a really soulful space as well.
Yeah, I think that's born partially just to experience life. Like you grow up and you kind of like, life is this. And then you step like a foot to the right and you're like, oh, but life is also this. And then you step a little bit further and you're like, oh, but it's also this. So which one is life? Right? And as you travel and as you go and you experience, you realize that life is billions of things for billions of different humans. And that so much, you know, in the culture I grew up in, Western world, you think that life is X, Y, and Z, and you have to do this. And then you go over to a place that's totally different, and they just cannot relate to why you're experiencing life the way you are. And in that, you kind of get back to the space where you're like, oh, these are all choices. And they might be choices that I have to make because the conditioning and the social group around me wants me to make them. But at the end of the day, they're still choices. Right. And in that, depending on, what level and ability you have to make the choices, you can start to give yourself room to curate what actually lights you up and to question, what's driving you to do these things. And I just deeply believe that like somebody who is in alignment with what choices they're making because it's who they are will always go further and faster and farther and be more engaged and do more creative work and experience things deeper. Because the will of the human spirit, when it's aligned, is extremely powerful, right? And so all of these different experiences, adventuring and traveling, have just been things that have allowed me to realize, oh, life can be also this, and also this, and also this, in just a really beautiful way that has made me feel just as a human being experiencing life on Earth that happens to have this perspective, and there's all these other ones. And it's really just sparked this like deep sense of curiosity to me of like, what's life like if you grow up in Morocco or in Turkey or somewhere totally different? And in a lot of ways, it's just made me feel more of like a human being and significantly less important as an individual in a really beautiful and humbling way, which for me just once again sparks that curiosity about life.
I love an exercise that maybe you'll appreciate as well, because even if I look out my window, I live in downtown Vancouver, and I'll literally just spend time, whether I sit on a bench or just stand and observe, and just remind myself that every single one of those humans that is walking around has their little voice that's going in their day. And you're like, whoa. And it is so that feeling of connection when you have that moment. And I think as humans, we forget that a little bit. And then when you look at what we went through over the last couple of years, I would say toward the beginning of that experience, there was this cool
that
connection.
7 p.m., bang your pots and pans. We're all just humans in this thing together.
Right? And I also am reassured by the fact that none of us really know what we're doing. And that also seems like the biggest opportunity to do exactly how you're living your life, in the fact that it is all about curiosity and exploration. What are your goals going forward? And I know it's probably hard to even define them since you are always in a state of play, but I do understand from learning a bit about yourself, it is about the ripple impact since we are so connected. So with the knowledge you have, how are you looking to share that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because you can have goals and also not care if you achieve them, right? And if I went back to like younger me, I was so fixated on the achievement of goals because unconsciously my entire validation system was structured around it, right? And so if goal didn't get accomplished, I wasn't accomplished. And just through a whole bunch of life events, you kind of hit this point, and I've realized that those goals, while meaningful to me, ultimately are just things to do, right? And the self-importance that I put on them was essentially my ego being like, you're so important, you have to do this or the world's not going to keep turning.
I can, I have suffered from that so many times in my life as the high achiever mindset back in the day that I have slowly been deconstructing and murdering to the ground. But it is so ego-driven when you're stuck in that mind space, and it's detrimental.
Well, and it's once again realizing, oh, it's a part of being a human being, but it is not all of being a human being. And the really interesting thing that I always play against is like, if I take this position as absolutely true, who am I basically saying is incorrect, right? Because if somebody doesn't have goals, then I'm like, oh, I'm better than you, right?
Right.
And so just to play with those things and just realize the drive is still there. I love the drive, but the drive is a pursuit of how I want to spend my time rather than something that's positioning me in the world as better or worse than everybody else. And it allows me to actually start to get way more creative and essentially bring all types of different people, many of which that I don't understand, don't agree with, and just bring them together and create, which if you look at the way, all of the fabric of biology has been built, it's basically built on diversity. Diversity equals resilience. And so the more we bring into worlds where diversity comes in, the more resilient we'll become as businesses, as friend groups, as societies, as, whatever we end up building. And so like understanding that, the goals are still very much there, but they're kind of like loosely held onto as my understanding of the world today. But most of them are just built around, building companies that steer people closer and closer to understanding themselves, connecting people around communities, creating with other people, making art for the sake of just putting thoughts and ideas out into the world, and just playing with all these different things inside containers that you would call businesses. But the business is just, once again, like a concept and a structure so that people understand what it is. When in reality, it's just, if you look at Apple, where it's like, where does Apple, the company, live? And you're like, well, it's the headquarters. And you're like, but it's also it's this amorphous thing, right? And so just kind of playing with all these ideas inside things that we call companies, but more just creating things that in a lot of ways bring humanity back into humanity in whatever way that aligns with me and the people, not in its entirety, but really just to play inside of it and be as close to feeling human as I can for all of it. And from that, letting whatever happens come out, right? And I used to sit there and be like, oh, no, but that sounds like a really wish-washy answer. And I'm like, cool.
Exactly.
Like, out of that will come things, but the more I want to hold on and be like, it's got to be this and it's got to be that, the more internally I feel like I'm trying to force things rather than flow with things.
How do you deal when you do have those moments where you catch yourself wrestling with that state, or almost building, like when we have that resistance that we can feel inside? How do you work through that? Because obviously you're very well practiced, but has there been any times along the journey where that's been quite a poignant feeling?
Every day. I think that's, like, sometimes I wonder, I'm like, is that just part of the human condition? Like, we'll term it as enoughness, where is that just a default state that the person that worries about whether they're enough continues to contribute in a way that keeps them socially valuable? Therefore, they stay valuable inside. Like, is that innately wired, or is that entirely socially trained in the world that we've grown up in?
Right.
And then understanding is the drive that comes out of me from a place of, does it feel good as it comes out, or does it feel like it's lack? And that I'm essentially compensating for something, or I'm frustrated by something, or I need the world to change in order for me to feel at peace. And generally when it comes from that more kind of sticky side is when I go back in and go back into meditation, go back into breath and just play with it. I don't really try and get anywhere with it, but just try and understand, oh, yeah, that's that again. Maybe pause, maybe slow down, maybe figure it out, and then try and reorient it back to play, right? And it really is one of those things that, no matter how many times you do it, I really do believe, maybe you get over it. I haven't yet, but maybe, it gets easier and easier and easier, but it's still kind of always there. And I found it really helpful just to surround myself like in environments with people that also do not care whether I am that thing or not. And that for me has probably been one of the biggest things where like I'm growing this story in my head about what I want to do and what I have to be. And then you're surrounded by people that are just like, hey, you want to go do this fun thing? And like there's this amazing thing that I saw the other day about this author that hit New York Times best-selling list, got number 2. And like his kid runs in the room. He's like, guess what? Your dad is number 2 on the New York Times best-selling list. And his kid's like, can I watch TV? And it's just that realization that like the achievements are so deeply driven internally, but externally generally mean less and less and less than we feel inside. And so just like reorienting that every time. Just to come back to a place where my nervous system feels calm and at peace and at rest, which is where I feel both the healthiest, but also the most adaptable to, step back into the world and play with it.
Yeah, I was reading when you had the biohacking on your site and just about the nervous system and its role in our daily lives. So explain to me a little bit about, obviously, I'm sure the rabbit holes are exceptionally deep, but what you mean by that when you're saying I'm trying to achieve and just calm the nervous system.
Yeah, and this is admittedly like something I've really gotten into lately. It's an extremely deep rabbit hole that you start to realize that you're like, this has been there the whole time. And tons of credit to a company called the Lab of Meditation and a lady named Hero who basically as a male, I'm like, no, I don't have emotions. You don't have all that stuff. And she just slowed me right down. And she's like, play with this. And you realize that there is essentially an engine inside of you called your nervous system that is operating your entire existence. And when it's stressed out, it does a whole bunch of things that are outside of your will to continue to propel you forward. And it lives in these different states that you never actually control, but can influence by your relationship with it, right? And so if we're living in states of chronic stress, it's actually changing the way the brain interprets the world around it, right? And most of us have no idea or no awareness that any of this stuff is happening. But as you bring awareness to it, and it can be through meditation, but it can simply be through really simple things like, am I breathing deep? Am I clutching onto my thoughts right away? Do I feel stressed? Labeling those things, which sounds really kind of slow and you're like, I don't really know what I'm doing, but you realize that there's a whole world of sensation inside of our bodies that is essentially trying to send signals to us to tell us what it's interpreting. And this is, hundreds of millions of years of intelligent evolution trying to tell us things that we're like, nope.
Yeah.
And so the last...
And very quickly, too.
Within hundredth of a millisecond, over and over and over again. And the really hard part about it is it's really hard to like understand what it's doing because it is inherently so subjective, right? And so you're, you know, if you're feeling angry and you're like, describe it to me, and you're like, it's red and it's sticky and you're like, what do we do with that? But what you realize is that in the exploration of it, you start to deepen that relationship with your nervous system, and it starts to actually begin to communicate back with you and tell you what it needs and put things in your field of view to ultimately, because it's trying to keep you safe, right? And so learning about that and understanding that and being like, whoa, there's a whole body of sensation here that's kind of pointing me either to what I deeply want or to what it thinks is safe has been so, you know, pivotal in helping me get back to a space where I'm actually in relation with my body and can sit there and just be like, and just sit and not have to be like, I need to go do, I need to, right? And now that you start to see it, you realize most people, especially in the Western world, are driven by the conditioning of their nervous system, not by what they actually seek. And it's because their nervous system doesn't feel safe. Their nervous system can't just sit there, right? And that goes back to what the conversation we had about meditation is, if you give your mind and nervous system 10 minutes once a week to speak, of course it's just going to go like,
Yeah, right?
Right?
It's like, I got to get this in here. I've never
I
been
got
asked
10 minutes,
before.
right? And that's the
So
really
true.
cool thing with meditation is like, as you do more and more of it, the reason why the mind quiets is because you've listened to it, right? The whole dam has slowly been emptied. And from there, you can actually start to see what it actually needs, right? And a lot of the time, what starts off as anger turns out to be fear, right? What starts as drive turns out to be, you know, insignificancy and not wanting to feel inadequate, right? And so as you move through all these defense mechanisms and emotions that we've had, you get to the space of like, oh, that's what's actually there. And once you're at that root, now we can play with it. Now we can understand it. Now we can unwind it. And when I think about just like wellness, I'm like, this is the stuff that we're starting to see come up because for, you know, many decades now, we've been so good at just moving through things. Eventually the dam overflows, right? And we're starting to get to that point that we're like, oh, it's spilling over. We need tools for this stuff. And they're starting to become so much more available, but they're also complex and not straightforward and kind of require you to sit in this space where you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing over and over and over again. But I always just say, like, trust the intelligence that your nervous system's communicating you with what it understands that you might not yet.
Thank you for spending the time today. Before I let you go, and this is going to be a tough question for you because I know you have a million of them, but I do love to leave people with one of the most inspirational nuggets that you've heard in your life that is a piece of wisdom that kind of shook you to your core and basically transformed the way you lived your life. So what would be one of those motivational nuggets?
Yeah, I think the one... It was the one that changed the way that I looked at life. And it's just this whole thing that black implies white, up implies down, in implies out, right? And the whole sequence of life is this thing between polarities. And that has allowed me to enjoy the hell out of the ups and realize that those ups are literally the other side of eventual downs. And that those eventual downs are not a malfunction of what I'm doing in my life, but rather just a part of the entire experience. And it's allowed me to sit so much more in the experiences of some of the worst moments of my life and really, really enjoy the up ones, knowing that over the course of my life, it's just going to continue to do that, which really has just brought me a ton of peace.
Love that. It's the ride. It's the ride of our lives.
It's what we ask for. And then we
Right?
get it and we're like, no.
Well, I don't know how to steer. That's okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thank
Literally
you.
such a beautiful human being. And I'm going to be picking your brain again without a doubt.
Anytime.
You've just listened to All Things Fitness and Wellness, the Celebrity Series. This episode was brought to you by the British Columbia Personal Training Institute. Learn how to train, gain, and retain clients. New episodes of the Industry Series drop every Monday and the Celebrity Series every Wednesday. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss out on hearing from industry thought leaders and influencers. We are on a mission to help everyone live a life fit and well.